Greetings everyone, this is Ahav Ever from the Chronicles of Ahav Ever, and today's video is going to be about what is Kabbalah. So first starting off with what does the word mean? So essentially all of ancient Hebrew worked upon a three-letter root system, meaning that when you are trying to understand what a text is saying, you have to first understand what each word is saying. In order to understand what each word is saying, you have to understand what the three-letter root of the word is, because that tells you the basic meaning that it starts off with. So in terms of this word Kabbalah, it is made up of a three-letter root of Kuf, Bet, Lamed. And essentially when dealing with the meaning of that three-letter root, it basically means in its basic form to receive, receiving or reception, and by extension tradition, as we'll see later in the video. Now in terms of Kabbalah, the basic issue here is that you have to understand that there's various types of Kabbalah. First type of Kabbalah, and dealing with, from looking at, almost like a scientific perspective, for example, which I'll be soon doing a video about Torath Mosheh and science. There's several different types of the Kabbalah as mentioned before. And the first is Qabbalah min Moshe, meaning that this is something that was received from Moshe Rabbeinu, or Moses, as people in English-speaking nations would say. And then there's also Divrei Kabbalah. And then there's also Kabbalah, which is based upon Masoret. Now, of course, this is something that I've covered in other videos, but we'll cover that also here. So to explain this idea, or to break it down into its most basic format, the Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, in the Mishnah Torah, in Hilchot Mamrim, Perek Aleph, explains it in the following, starting at the green. And again, Hebrew is read from right to left. He says, Achad Devorim shelamdu otan mipi shmuah, behem Torah shbal peh. So he says that one of the things that was learned from the Creator was the Torah shbal peh, meaning the oral Torah. Essentially, starting in the yellow, he says, "Ve'achad devorim shelamadu otam mipi da'aton me'achat min hamidot shel haTorah nidreshet behem v'nir'eh be'anehem shehadin b'davar ze kach hu." So he says that the next thing that is basically learned is something that comes from the different principles that were given on how to make judgments based upon the Torah. So going to the blue, it says, "V'achad devorim she'asu otam sayog laTorah ulefi ma she'asha'a tzaricha v'hem hajezorot v'hatakanot v'haminagot." So essentially in the blue, it's saying that the next thing is things that were done to, in English they usually say put a fence around the Torah, but it's basically like saying to safeguard the practice of the Torah for the needs. So for example, if there is a need in a particular situation, these are the basic rulings that are based upon this need to be able to do something to protect the Torah, the practice of the Torah. Generally speaking, the Torah doesn't need protection, but it's the practice of it amongst people. So in the non-colored section, continuing on to the end, so essentially, if you were to take this into short, what this is basically saying, starting with the last part that I read that's not colored, essentially what it says is that these three principles, or these three things that we mentioned earlier, are positive mitzvot, meaning that they're mitzvot that the people of Israel are required to do. And to not do them is considered to be an avirah, or transgression of the Torah. And we'll see why that is in just a second. But essentially, if you were to put this in short, it says that some of the oral Torah came from Hashem. Some of the principles of the oral Torah we learn from principles that Hashem gave for the judicial courts, the Mosaic courts, to make legal decisions. And some come directly from the decisions made by Mosaic courts, all of which are included in the mitzvot. So essentially, these things are the principles that are found in the Torah for the mitzvot. So continuing the Mishnah Torah in Hilchot Mamrim Perek Aleph, later in section Daled, the Rambam explains the following. Hore, and this is starting the yellow. Hore hu omer alpi Torah sher yorucho, that's from Devorim Yud Zayin, section Yud Aleph. Elu hajezorot v'hatakonot v'hamenagot sheyoru bahem lorabim kedei lachazak adot ולתקון העולם, על המשפט אשר יאמרו לך תעשה. So essentially, the part in the yellow that we just read is quoting the part of the Torah that comes from Devarim, which in English is called Deuteronomy 17:11. And what it basically says is that, and part of the Torah that they will teach you. Essentially, this is a command to the people of Israel. Again, the Torah being the commands given to the people of Israel. And it's essentially talking about following the Mosaic courts, and also the rulings that they make, whether the rulings are things that are made because of the principles we mentioned earlier, or things that are needed for that particular situation in order to strengthen the application and the performance of the Torah. And then when it quotes later from that same pasuk, or the same section, it says, "Ba'al mishpat asher yamoru lecha v'ta'aseh." So that's translated into the part that says that whatever they say to do per the Torah that Hashem gave, that's what the Jewish people as a nation are supposed to do. Now in the gray it says, Elu davorim shelamadu otam min hadin be'achat min hamidot she'atorah nidreshet bahem mikol davar asher yajidu lacho re'eh sham. So essentially, this part here is continuing and mentioning that the things that they or what that were taught concerning the principles that were given for making these particular rulings is also covered when it says in the Torah that the things that they will tell you, that's what we'll do. And again, this is a mitzvah to the Jewish people. Now, ending off in the gray, but then starting in the green, it says Zo HaKabbalah Shekiblu Ish Mipi Ish. So the green part is saying that this is the Kabbalah that was received. So Shekiblu HaKabbalah. So this is the tradition or what's been received. Shekiblu Ish Mipi Ish. So essentially, this was transmitted from person to person. And again, this is not just saying some regular person. This is like saying from Jew to Jew, meaning, for example, from those who teach the Torah to those who learn Torah from them, from the time of Moses all the way until the modern era, and also from father to son. So in short, looking at a short translation of this, some Kabbalah comes from the Mosaic court that were making rulings. These were passed down from teacher to teacher, as well as them being leaders, to their students through the generations of Israeli and Jewish communities. And you also have to take into account that a teacher leader is also the father. So, essentially, I think I mentioned in a previous video that these are things that are also passed down from fathers to sons and so on and so on. So essentially what that means is that from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu till the present era, you have people who within the Jewish community have taught the Torah that they received from the previous generation and from their teachers and from their fathers. And those things have been passed down from that time until the present era without break. Even if in certain communities there was a break, there was never a worldwide Jewish break in the transmission of the Torah. And this process continues even to this day. In fact, even in the language that it was given in when the Torah was given thousands of years ago. So then the next step, still remaining in this section of the Mishneh Torah, in Aleph Hey, section Hey, essentially what the Rambam mentions, and starting in the yellow, Divrei HaKabbalah ein behem machloket le'olam. So essentially what he says is that the words of Kabbalah, Divrei Kabbalah, there's no machloket, which means like there's no dispute about them. There's never a dispute about them. And he says in the green, "B'chol davar shetimsa bo machloket bo yadua she'eino Kabbalah mimoshe Rabbeinu." So he says that if there is a thing that is for a debate or something that's not agreed upon, where there's a basic division in whether or not it's agreed upon that this is Kabbalah, that thing is definitely not Kabbalah from Moshe. So it's not Kabbalah that comes from Moshe Rabbeinu. So if there was a thing like, let's say someone says that the practice we're supposed to do is this over here, and there's groups of people who said, no, it's not that, it's this over here, then we know that those things don't come from Moshe Rabbeinu if there's a big debate about them. But there are a number of things that we know that do come from Moshe Rabbeinu, which nobody debates about those particular things in practice. They may debate about the sources of how we understand them, the sources of how we know how to do certain details of the practice, but they don't disagree that the practice is this one thing in certain areas. Then it continues in the non-colored parts. Uvdavurim shelamodim min hadin, im hiskimu alehem bet din agadol kulam, hare hiskimu. Im nachlaku bahem holachim achare horov, umitziin hadin achot lerabim. So essentially that part says that the things that comes up for like judgment, things that need to be judged upon, if there's agreement amongst the Bet Din, Hagadol, meaning the Sanhedrin, or the Supreme Court, the Supreme Mosaic Court, if you will, the Supreme Court of Mosaic Courts. If there's agreement, then that's what it is. That's what the practice is, and that's what's been received. But if there is a disagreement in it, we go by the majority, and that comes from the Torah, that we hold by the majority, and we rule based upon the majority. And that's mainly, not saying that every individual rules based on the majority, but that essentially the Mosaic courts based upon the majority in areas that are questionable, or areas where we don't have something that was transmitted to us on how to do it, using those principles mentioned earlier. So in short, some Kabbalah comes from Moshe ben Amram, meaning Moses, as you would say in English. It is only Kabbalah in this sense if the Mosaic courts agree without dispute. If there's a dispute, it didn't come from Moshe Rabbeinu. So that's, simply put. So that would mean that, for example, Moshe Rabbeinu received from Hashem initially orally mitzvot from the Torah, some of which he wrote down at different points. And then before he passed away, he was given the complete text of the Torah to write down, which he had also transmitted orally exactly how to do those mitzvot during the 40 years in the Midbar, in the wilderness. And then before he passed away, he explained it to anyone who was willing to, any of the people of Israel who came and listened to hear those particular parts of how to actually do the Torah in practice. So then the next segment of Kabbalah that was mentioned in that particular first area is continuing with the Rambam says in the Mishnah Torah, Perek Aleph, basically Pasuk Hayat. אם היה דבר שנולד בו הספק לכל ידוע אצל בית הדין הגדול, that's in the yellow. So if there was, some form of thing that was like a disagreement or, highly questionable issue that came about in the Bet Din, and then going in the green says, Ben mipi Kabbalah, ben min hamidah shedanu bo, omrim lahem miyad. So essentially, if there was something that came up as a question, in terms of what's Kabbalah, if something's Kabbalah or not, or something that was received, then it would be taken to the Bet Din Gadol, meaning the Supreme Mosaic Court in Jerusalem, immediately. And in the blue, אם לא היה דבר ברור אצל בית דין הגדול, דונין בו בשעתון, ונוזעים ונותנים בדבר אלא שיסכימו כולן. או שיעמדו למניין וילכו אחר הרוב. So this goes back and reinforces what we mentioned earlier, that if something was brought to the Bet Din Gadol, meaning the Supreme Mosaic Court in Jerusalem, and they would basically go over the issue, they would debate it, discuss it, look for sources for it, and they would either agree upon it, meaning that everybody on that particular Mosaic Court would agree, or if there was like disagreements about it, they would go based upon the majority. That again comes from the Torah to go by the majority for judicial rulings, for what's called halakha, and also for this issue of something that's considered to be whether it's Kabbalah or not. And then in the gray it says, so essentially they would rule and say, okay, to the people asking, this is the halakha, and then everybody would go by it, and that's what's required. If it comes from the Mosaic Court, we go by it, because again, it's by its own nature, by name. Bet Din Agadol means it's the Supreme Court, and we go by that. There's no, for example, saying, okay, well, I don't know, well, let's go by something else. They're the top leaders of the generation, for every generation, and they're essentially following the process that Hashem had given to Moshe ben Amram. So in short, if there's a dispute on something being Kabbalah, it is taken up with the Mosaic Court of that generation, and we go by the majority. Their rulings are the practice / decision / Jewish law for all of Am Yisrael, meaning that all of Am Yisrael who are in the land of Israel, this is what we hold by when there is this type of court. So again, this type of court would be, as an example, let's say that there was an issue of, setting the dates for the months. Those things come from the Bet Din Gadol when there is a Bet Din Gadol. If there's a Mosaic court in Jerusalem, whenever there are witnesses who say that they saw that there was a new moon, Chodesh, essentially the Bet Din Gadol would have to receive that information. They would have to discuss it, debate it, verify it, check the witnesses, and then from there, they're the ones who announce that there is a Chodesh. Which makes sense, because you wouldn't want a situation where everybody's declaring, the new month, based upon whatever their understanding is, and all of the practices concerning the Jewish calendar have to align with each other across the board throughout the country. So this would be required on from an agreement from the Supreme Court, if you will, the Supreme Mosaic Court, in order to put things into practice. And that goes with any issue of Kabbalah or anything that deals with a Judaic or Torah-based necessity, for example. So going even further, going into the Talmud in Masechet Sota, Perek Aleph, Daf Lamed Zayin, Aleph Gemara, it says the following: Kafetz Nachshon ben Aminodov, ויורד ליום תחילו שנאמר. And it's quoting Hosea, Yud which is 12. סבובנו בחחש, אפרים וממרה, בית ישראל ויהודו עוד יורד עם אל. And then it says, ועליו מפורש בקבלה, quoting תהילים, סמך ט', basically says, הושיענו אלוהים כי ראו מיום עד נפש. So essentially what it's saying is that it's basically making the point that this particular question that comes up is using a methodology where they're saying using the Tanakh to support. So essentially what it's saying, according to the Talmud here, is that the Tanakh, meaning that the parts of the Tanakh, the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim, meaning the prophetic books and the writings of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Tanakh, are Kabbalah. That's essentially what this is in the Talmud here, that part of the non-Torah portions of the Tanakh are Kabbalah. Now, what that essentially means is that, as I mentioned in the previous video, the Tanakh is broken up into sections. It's basically taking the Torah, the Nevi'im sections of the writings of the prophets and the histories that were written in those, like such as, for example, Yehoshua ben Nun, let's say, also the Shoftim, then also Shmuel, Yeshayahu, Melachim, things like that, and also the Ketuvim, the writings like, for example, Tehillim, Mishle. All of those two sections that are not Torah are considered, according to the Talmud, Kabbalah or Divrei Kabbalah. So one of the ways to understand this in terms of how Kabbalah was transmitted from the time of the given Torah to the modern era is, as we mentioned before, there is Kabbalah from Moshe Rabbeinu. And that Kabbalah has remained until the present era, meaning that it was passed down throughout the generations. From the time of Moshe Rabbeinu to the time of the Nevi'im, the prophets that existed in the land of Israel, until the exiles, until the modern day. It's been passed down, and not just in one community, not just in one location, but amongst all Jews, even after the exiles. And essentially, the next step in that process was Kabbalah, which was Divrei Kabbalah, coming from the time of the Nevi'im, the time of the prophets. So essentially, the things that they were passing down was also a type of Kabbalah. In some cases, there were things that they were mentioning that came from Moshe Rabbeinu. In some cases, there were things that came from different rulings that had been made during those generations. Now, the next step is Kabbalah Masorah, that either is verifiable, meaning that it goes back to the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, in which nobody questions it because it's verified that it came from that period, or things that came from anywhere in between, as well as what you see below the red section is the uncertain areas. And I'll explain what that means in just a second. So you have certain types of Kabbalah that are verifiable, meaning that you can look up what the sources are and find them, and you find them common amongst all Jewish communities. And there's certain types of Kabbalah that are uncertain because it's kind of questionable what the source is or where it came from or how old it actually is. And in some cases it may be questioned because it's only found in one community, or some people have elevated it up to be something that it may or may not have been. So now, getting to this point, you may be asking the critical question when people come up with this particular topic, with the name of the topic. You may say, okay, well, what about the mysticism? You haven't talked anything about mysticism. Isn't Kabbalah like Jewish mysticism? And the reality is that if you look at Jewish text about what this, what things I think you could probably say maybe got the idea that there's something that's like mysticism, because the reality, the word Kabbalah, as we mentioned before, doesn't mean mysticism. Even the information, no matter what period you look at, until the modern era, it wasn't really like mysticism and even defined as such. But the question then becomes, like I mentioned earlier, is, well, what's the source for such a thing? If something's believed, what do we go by in terms of a source? Where do we get it from? So one of the things that's interesting that the Rambam mentions is the Mishnah Torah in Hilchot Kiddush HaChodesh, Perek Yud Zayin, and this is dealing with the declaration of the new moon. He says in the following, in Yud Zayin Kaf Dalet, and this is starting in the yellow. וטעם כל אלו החשבונות, ומפני מה המוספים במניין זה, ומפני מה הג'וראים, והאח נודע כל דבר ודבר מאלו הדברים, והראויה על כל דבר ודבר היא חוכמת התקופות והג'מטריות שחיברו בו חכמי יוון הספרים הרבה, והם מצויים עכשיו ביד החכמים. So essentially what he's mentioning is that there was like mathematics and sciences that the Greeks had developed, and that essentially those things were known amongst the leaders of the Jewish people, the wise men of the Jewish people, the rabbis, the chachamim of the Jewish people. And going in the green, he says, "Aval haseforim shechiboru chachmei Yisrael shehayu b'mei haneviim mibnei Yisachar lo higiu eleinu." So essentially what he's talking about is not just like knowledge, but books. He's mainly saying that there were books that were developed in Greece, for example, and that's going back to the yellow, that is known amongst the leaders of his time as well as in the modern time. But he says that there were also similar types of mathematic books and sciences and books of science that were basically put together, created by the members of the tribe of Yisachar. So the tribe of Yisachar, which Yisachar was one of the 12 sons of Yaakov, of Jacob. So essentially the Israelis, or the Jews of that particular tribe, had also developed their own books of like science and mathematics, but that those actual books, not always the information, but more like the books themselves, have been lost, because of the fact of the exile that took place in the northern kingdoms, and also because of the members of the northern kingdoms, basically falling into what's called Avodah Zarah, which I mentioned in a previous video. So then this brings us into this big issue, as I was mentioning earlier, is that when people may say, okay, well, most people, when they think Kabbalah, they think of a lot of weird kind of mystical, and even modernly, they think of things that are even distanced from like the stuff that was in the Middle Ages that was claimed about it. So you sometimes find people like Madonna, or like this particular guy who's like supposedly a rabbi in America, who basically serves like celebrities and things like that, and you have people writing all kind of books about like alchemy and then Kabbalah and tarot cards, and you even got like missionaries, and messianics who are trying to say that yes, you had like type of Kabbalah, but all of this is basically fake. One of the reasons that all this stuff is fake is because it's basically a scam, and the reason is because there are people who know that they can sell books with anything that sounds like some kind of new age material that seems to unlock the secrets of the universe kind of stuff. And if you look at what I mentioned earlier about what Kabbalah is, it's not one of those kind of things. And now, what is important to remember about Kabbalah, and this is something that's not really known amongst the circles who kind of follow the New Age kind of Kabbalah, or what's claimed to be Kabbalah, and it's actually in reality much of it is not, is that in order for someone to have studied, like I would say several hundred years ago to 1,000 years ago, to study something that would be considered Kabbalah, you'd first have to know Torah in Hebrew, as well as in Aramaic translation. You would have to know the rest of the Tanakh in Hebrew, as well as Aramaic translation, and you'd have to know Halakha. And these are like the tools that you would need to be able to kind of, if you will, swim through the ocean of Kabbalah to determine what actually came from Moshe Rabbeinu, what came from the Nevi'im, and what came through the generations, and what is just something that is an idea that maybe this rabbi over here had, or this leader over here had, or this person here ever had. And this is the only way you would be able to know these things is to know Torah, Tanakh, and Halakha first. And that's why a lot of people didn't study certain types of Kabbalah until they turned 40 years old, because they needed the tools to be able to know what is wrong and right, and what is correct information, and what is not, and what is speculative. So this would be no different than saying, okay, well, I want to build this complex circuit, but I don't want to learn the mathematics it takes to get there. And that's what you kind of see in people who talk about Kabbalah nowadays, especially those in the Western world who don't study Hebrew, don't study Torah, and just kind of jump in because they're looking for something new age. And it's like someone trying to design a complex circuit with no knowledge of like circuit design, no knowledge of algebra, no knowledge of calculus, no knowledge of logic. And all those things are the baseline or the basis of determining how you build circuits, and that's the thing, that if someone doesn't understand that, you can't really get from like, you can't get to the end result without having like some foundation. And the foundation, beyond the Torah, the Tanakh, the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim, and also the Halakha, is a number of books that have been written over the generations that a person would have to be able to like go through across the spectrum of Jewish thought. To be able to come to certain conclusions. And again, this is not some magic conclusion where someone's sitting down and trying to form, like living things out of like materials, because there's some people say that's nonsense, no matter from what source you get it from, that those things don't actually exist in reality. But the only way somebody would know that or not would be to like look through all the generations of Jewish information to see, okay, if 1,000 years ago nobody was talking like this about, like, if you see, let's say you go to the Kabbalah Center, I think it's in California, and you find out that 1,000 years ago nobody was talking like the people who go to those places, or you find things that Madonna mentions, and you're like, okay, well, where does she get that from? Did she learn Hebrew to learn that? No. Did she learn from anything from Rab Sadiagon? What about the Rambam? What about the Ramban? What about the Ibn Ezra? Where did she get that from? Where did they get that from? And these are the type of tools that would be needed to know whether or not this kind of stuff is just a scam, where someone's pulling the wool over your eyes, or just something that can actually be traced back to an ancient source. Because the basic principle is that everything must point back to Torath Mosheh. And that's the basic principle of anything dealing with Torah, Halacha, and Kabbalah of any type. Because essentially, if it's something that has been transmitted through the generations, you should find it somewhere that traces itself back to the Torah, and not just some kind of modern or new age thing. So, in summary, the one of the principles that's brought down in the book of the Kuzari is the following. It says, "Halila la'el shetovu haTorah b'ma sheyidha royol o mofet ach tovo b'niflaot b'shanot u'minhagim livuriyat devorim o להפוך דבר על דבר אחר, להורות על חכמת בורא ועולם והחלטו לעשות מה שחופץ בעת שיחפוץ." And essentially translating that just in general, as I've mentioned before in other videos, that the Torah is not put here to contradict what is seen and proven to be true. Now again, this is not something that people theorize to be true, but something that's seen and proven to be true. The Torah is not given to contradict those things. And essentially that's what one of the major principles is that the fact that the Torah was given to confirm the world that we live in, and the scientific evaluation that we make of the world we live in. The Torah is like there to be the basis of how we Jews determine what the reality is, for example. But it's not something that's here to like say, okay, well, the Torah says this, so therefore we found gravity to be this over here. We've proven it to be this over here. Okay, well, we have to accept that the Torah is here to contradict it, so let's just throw out our reason and just like believe something, even if we may be wrong about what we believe. And that's the thing that the Rambam actually explained at one point, that essentially, that a person has to be able to look and say, okay, my understanding of the Torah could be wrong in this area if it's something that seems to contradict what the reality is, because the Torah is not here to contradict reality. It's here to like help us establish and affirm the reality. So again, this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. Take care and have a good night.